Welcome to Sleepless Ancient Odyssey. The day is done. It is time now to let the noise of your world fade into silence. Find your most comfortable position, and for the next few moments, simply relax. Tonight's Odyssey is about to begin. Tonight, we journey to the sun-scorched sands of ancient Egypt, to a place that has haunted explorers for over 2,000 years. You will witness the grandeur of a monument that rivaled the pyramids themselves. You will walk among priests who guarded secrets beneath the desert floor, and you will discover why the greatest structure of the ancient world vanished almost without trace. This is not merely history. This is the story of hubris and memory, of power that crumbles, and mysteries that endure. Whether you are here for a story to captivate your mind, or a grand narrative to accompany you to sleep, your journey starts now. If you enjoy these odysseys, subscribe, and join us every time we travel to the past. Now, let us begin. The desert south of Cairo keeps its secrets well. Sand stretches toward every horizon, interrupted only by the dark silhouettes of pyramids that have stood for millennia. The wind moves constantly here, reshaping dunes, exposing stones that have not seen sunlight for centuries, then burying them again. It is a landscape of impermanence, where even monuments to eternity slowly disappear. But there is one place, near the ancient site of Hawara, where the sand conceals something extraordinary, something that the ancient Greeks declared more magnificent than all the pyramids combined, something that has vanished so completely that modern scholars once questioned whether it ever existed at all. The locals know this place. They call it by various names, remnants of older tongues. When asked what lies beneath the sand, they speak of vast chambers, of corridors that run for miles, of ceilings held aloft by forests of columns. They speak of the labyrinth. In the 5th century before the Common Era, a Greek traveler named Herodotus came to Egypt. He was a curious man, hungry for wonders, and Egypt did not disappoint. He saw the great pyramids at Giza, walked through temples whose columns seemed to hold up the sky itself, and marveled at the Sphinx with its enigmatic smile. But when Herodotus came to Hawara, he found something that left him searching for words adequate to describe it. He called it the labyrinth, borrowing the Greek term for an impossibly complex maze. But this was no mythical construction from legend. This was real, and it was staggering. Herodotus wrote that the labyrinth contained 3,000 rooms, half above the ground, half below. He walked through its upper chambers, counting corridors that seemed to multiply the further he ventured. Courts opened onto courts, halls led to halls, passages twisted back upon themselves in patterns that defied memory. He wrote that it surpassed even the pyramids in the labor required to build it, in the intricacy of its design, in the sheer audacity of its conception. Other ancient writers confirmed his account. Strabo came centuries later and described the same marvel. Pliny the Elder recorded its dimensions and spoke of its countless chambers. For the ancient world, the labyrinth of Hawara was as real and as remarkable as any wonder they knew. And then it disappeared. Not suddenly, not in a single catastrophic event, but slowly, gradually, the way great things sometimes fade when no one is watching closely enough. The sand crept in. Stone was quarried away by those who saw only building material, not history. Centuries passed. The labyrinth, which had dominated this landscape for 2,000 years, became a ghost, then a rumor, then a question mark in ancient texts that fewer and fewer people believed. By the 19th century, when European explorers began mapping Egypt's antiquities with scientific precision, they found no trace of the legendary labyrinth. They found the pyramid of Hawara, yes, but no massive complex of 3,000 rooms. Some scholars began to suggest that Herodotus had exaggerated, or that he had been deceived, or that the ancient writers had simply repeated each other's errors until fiction became accepted as fact. But the desert keeps its secrets, and beneath the sand at Hawara, something vast still waits. To understand what the labyrinth was and why it mattered so profoundly to the ancient Egyptians, we must travel back further still, back to a time when Egypt was not yet the unified kingdom of pharaohs and pyramids, back to when the land along the Nile was still finding its shape, its purpose, its soul. We must go back to the Middle Kingdom, to the 12th dynasty, to the reign of a pharaoh named Amenemhat III. Amenemhat III ruled Egypt for nearly half a century in the 19th century before the Common Era. His reign came at a time when Egypt had reclaimed its power after a period of fragmentation and chaos. The Middle Kingdom was an age of renaissance, of renewed confidence, of ambition. But Amenemhat was not like the pyramid builders of old. He did not seek to touch the sky with monuments of stone. His vision was more practical, more revolutionary. He looked at the desert and saw potential. He looked at the flood cycles of the Nile and saw a challenge that human ingenuity could overcome. The Nile, that great green artery cutting through an ocean of sand, was Egypt's life. Every year it flooded, covering the fields with rich black silt that made the narrow strip of land along its banks the most fertile in the known world. But the flood was unpredictable. Some years it came weak, and famine followed. Other years it came too strong, washing away villages and drowning livestock. Egypt lived and died by water it could not control. Amenemhat decided to control it. In the Fayum, a vast depression in the desert southwest of Memphis, there lay a natural basin connected to the Nile by channels. Here, Amenemhat ordered the construction of a massive hydraulic engineering project. His workers deepened the basin, widened the channels, built locks and levees, and sophisticated control systems. They transformed a marshy lowland into what would become known as Lake Moeris, one of the ancient world's greatest reservoirs. The lake could store excess floodwater in years of abundance and release it in years of scarcity. It turned the Fayum from a marginal region into a paradise of agriculture. Fields of wheat and barley spread where once there had been little but papyrus swamps. Villages grew into towns. The population multiplied. Egypt became more secure, more prosperous, more powerful than it had been in generations. This was Amenemhat's true pyramid, not a mountain of stone meant only to house his corpse, but a living monument that fed his people and stabilized his kingdom. The ancient writers remembered him as a wise ruler, a builder of practical wonders, a king who understood that true power came not from monuments to the gods, but from mastery of the natural world. Yet Amenemhat knew something else as well. He knew that power, even the most practical power, requires symbols. It requires spaces where that power can be made visible, tangible, overwhelming. The people needed to see their pharaoh's greatness embodied in stone. The bureaucracy needed a center, a place where the complexity of administering Egypt could be organized and displayed. The gods needed temples, and the dead needed tombs. And so Amenemhat conceived of something unprecedented, a structure that would serve all these purposes at once, a building that would be tomb, temple, palace, and administrative center combined, a monument that would reflect the complexity of Egypt itself with all its nomes and districts, its gods and rituals, its living and its dead. He ordered the construction of the labyrinth. The site chosen was Hawara, at the edge of the Fayum, overlooking the agricultural paradise he had created. Here, beside his pyramid, the great work began. Thousands of workers labored for decades. They quarried limestone and granite. They cut massive blocks and dragged them across the desert. They built foundations that could support a structure of unprecedented size and intricacy. The design was revolutionary. Rather than a single temple or palace, the labyrinth would be a city unto itself. Courts and halls would represent each of Egypt's administrative districts. Chapels would be dedicated to every major deity in the Egyptian pantheon. Underground chambers would house the royal burial and countless treasures. The entire complex would be roofed, creating a vast interior space where sunlight filtered through high windows, illuminating corridors that seemed to go on forever. Amenemhat did not live to see it completed. He died and was entombed in his pyramid at Hawara, his body laid to rest in a massive quartzite sarcophagus deep within the structure. But the labyrinth continued to rise. His successors completed the vision, adding their own elements, expanding the complex, filling it with statuary and inscriptions and offerings. By the time it was finished, the labyrinth covered an area larger than several city blocks. Its walls enclosed 12 great courts, each dedicated to a different region of Egypt. Within those courts, nearly 3,000 rooms served every conceivable purpose. Some were chapels for worship, their walls covered in hieroglyphic prayers. Others were administrative offices, where scribes tallied grain harvests and recorded tax payments. Still others were treasure houses, storerooms, libraries, and chambers whose purposes have been lost to time. The roof was made of single slabs of stone, each weighing many tons, laid across the entire complex. The scale was almost incomprehensible. To walk from one end of the labyrinth to the other required traversing hundreds of yards of corridors. To explore every room would take days, perhaps weeks, and beneath it all, carved into the bedrock, lay the subterranean levels. Here, in darkness, the true mysteries resided. To enter the labyrinth was to enter another world. The massive doorway that served as the main entrance opened onto a columned hall of such vastness that the far wall was barely visible in the dim interior light. Columns rose in neat rows, each one carved from a single piece of stone, each one topped with capitals shaped like lotus flowers or papyrus plants. The ceiling above was lost in shadow. The air inside was different from the air outside, cooler, heavier, scented with incense and lamp oil. Sound behaved strangely here. Footsteps echoed, but voices seemed muffled, absorbed by the stone. There was a sense of being inside something alive, some massive organism with its own atmosphere and acoustics. From that first hall, doorways opened in every direction. A visitor could choose any of them and find themselves in another hall, equally grand, with more doorways leading to more halls beyond. The design was intentionally complex, a physical manifestation of divine order that human minds could not fully comprehend. To wander the labyrinth without guidance was to become lost in a maze of stone and shadow. But there was order beneath the apparent chaos. The Egyptians who built this place understood it completely. Each section corresponded to a nome, one of the administrative districts into which Egypt was divided. Each nome had its own court within the labyrinth, its own chapels, its own chambers for conducting the business of that region. Officials who came to Hawara from every corner of Egypt could find their way to their designated area, conduct their affairs, and participate in the grand rituals that unified the kingdom. The 12 great courts were the heart of the complex. Each was an open space surrounded by columns, open to the sky through clear story windows that allowed sunlight to pour in. The light struck the polished limestone walls and reflected in shifting patterns as the sun moved across the sky. At certain hours, certain chambers would be brilliantly illuminated, while others remained in shadow. The play of light and dark was itself a kind of language, a temporal code that marked the passage of days and seasons. In the courts, processions would gather, priests in white linen robes, their heads shaved, their feet bare on the cool stone floor. They carried offerings, bread and beer, incense and flowers, cuts of meat, and jars of wine. They chanted hymns whose words had been ancient when the labyrinth was new. The sound would build and echo through the halls, filling the entire structure with devotion made audible. Between the courts lay the forest of rooms. Some were tiny, barely large enough for a single person to stand in, their walls covered entirely in hieroglyphs. These were perhaps teaching rooms, places where initiates learned to read the sacred language, or meditation cells where priests sought communion with the divine. Others were vast halls that could accommodate hundreds of people, their ceilings supported by rows of columns that seemed to march away into infinity. The scribes had their own section, a warren of rooms where Egypt's records were kept. Here, on papyrus scrolls and ostraca shards, the entire machinery of the kingdom was documented. Harvest yields from every nome, tax receipts, legal disputes and their resolutions, temple inventories, the census of cattle and goats, the deployment of work gangs for royal projects, birth records and death records, marriage contracts and property transfers. Everything that made Egypt function was written down and stored here in the labyrinth's memory. Then there were the treasure chambers, rooms filled with gold and silver, with precious stones and rare woods, with bolts of fine linen and jars of exotic oils. The wealth of a kingdom accumulated over generations, stored in darkness and guarded by massive doors fitted with complex locks. Only the highest officials knew which doors led to which treasures, and only the pharaoh himself held all the keys. The walls throughout the complex were covered in art. Reliefs showed the pharaoh making offerings to the gods, defeating Egypt's enemies, ensuring Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept chaos at bay. Painted scenes depicted the journey of the sun god Ra through the hours of night, battling the serpent Apophis, emerging triumphant at dawn. Every surface was a text, every image a prayer or a lesson or a memory preserved in stone. Statues stood in alcoves and at the ends of halls. Some were colossal, towering figures of pharaohs and gods carved from red granite or black basalt, their faces severe and eternal. Others were life-sized or smaller, depicting officials and priests, nobles and scribes, even common workers who had contributed to the labyrinth's construction. The stone figures watched over the living who moved through these spaces, a reminder that the past was never truly past, that the dead remained present, observing, judging, remembering. But for all the grandeur of the upper levels, it was what lay below that truly defined the labyrinth. The entrance to the lower labyrinth was not easy to find. Hidden behind a particular door, down a particular corridor, in a section of the complex that only the initiated could navigate, a stairway descended into darkness. The steps were worn smooth by countless feet, leading down through solid rock into chambers that had never seen the sun. Down here, the temperature dropped. The air was still, ancient, undisturbed by wind. Lamps had to be carried, their flickering light casting wild shadows on walls that pressed close. The sense of weight was palpable. Millions of tons of stone and sand above, pressing down, held at bay only by the genius of the architects who had carved these spaces from the living rock. The lower labyrinth was said to match the upper level in size and complexity. 1,500 rooms beneath the earth, mirroring the 1,500 rooms above. But where the upper level served the living, the lower level belonged to the dead. This was the true burial complex, the necropolis that stretched beneath the sands of Hawara. Not just the pharaoh's tomb, but chambers for the royal family, for high priests and officials, for anyone deemed worthy of eternal rest in proximity to the god-king. Sarcophagi of stone rested in these chambers, sealed and marked with protective spells. The walls were inscribed with passages from the Book of the Dead, instructions for navigating the afterlife, prayers for safe passage through the 12 hours of night. The Egyptians believed that death was not an ending, but a transition. The soul had to travel through the underworld, the duat, facing trials and judgment before reaching the field of reeds where the blessed dead dwelt forever. The tomb was not merely a place to store a corpse, but a machine for ensuring that transition went smoothly. Every element of its design, every spell inscribed on its walls, every offering placed within it, served a purpose in the deceased's journey. In the lower labyrinth, this purpose was magnified 1,000-fold. Here was not just a tomb, but an entire underworld recreated in stone. Corridors represented the winding paths through the duat. Chambers represented the halls of judgment, the caverns of monsters, the gates guarded by demons with knives. To be buried here was to begin the afterlife journey with every advantage, surrounded by magic and protection, in a space that had been consecrated by the most powerful rituals Egypt knew. Herodotus wrote that he was not permitted to enter the lower labyrinth. The priests who showed him the upper levels refused to take him below. Those chambers, they said, contained the tombs of the sacred crocodiles of Sobek and the bodies of the kings who built this place. They were too holy for foreign eyes. Perhaps this was true. Perhaps the priests simply wanted to preserve some mysteries, even from the curious Greek. Or perhaps they themselves no longer fully understood what lay in those depths, the original knowledge having been lost over the centuries. Whatever the truth, the lower labyrinth remained secret. While visitors marveled at the upper halls, below them lay an entire shadow complex, equally vast, equally intricate, its passages and chambers known only to a select few. And there was something else down there, if the whispers can be believed, something beyond burial chambers and treasure rooms. The ancient texts hint at it obliquely in passages that are fragmentary and ambiguous. They speak of the place where secrets are kept, of the chamber of forbidden wisdom, of the heart of the maze where truth dwells. Some scholars believe these references point to a library, a repository of knowledge hidden in the deepest part of the labyrinth. Egypt had many libraries, collections of papyri containing everything from mathematical treatises to magical spells, from star charts to medical texts, from histories to myths. But the library in the labyrinth, if it existed, would have been special. It would have contained the knowledge deemed too dangerous or too sacred for common access, the true names of the gods which gave power over them, the complete rituals for opening the mouth of the dead, the formulas for transmuting substances and extending life, the maps of the afterlife in greater detail than any tomb painting showed. Or perhaps it contained something else entirely, something the ancient Egyptians discovered and decided must be hidden away, guarded by the most impenetrable structure they could devise, buried beneath the desert where only the most determined or the most blessed could ever hope to find it. We cannot know for certain. What we do know is that the labyrinth stood for nearly 2,000 years, a monument to Egyptian power and ingenuity, a wonder that drew travelers from across the known world. Kings and conquerors, priests and philosophers, they all came to see it. They walked its halls in amazement. They tried to count its rooms and got lost in the counting. They left inscriptions marveling at what they had seen. And then, slowly, the world changed around it. Egypt, which had endured for 3,000 years, began to change in ways that would have been unimaginable to Amenemhat III. Foreign powers came, not as raiders to be driven off, but as conquerors who stayed. The Persians arrived first, turning Egypt into a province of a vast empire. Then came Alexander, the young Macedonian king who claimed the throne of the pharaohs and founded a new capital at Alexandria. After Alexander died, his general Ptolemy took Egypt for himself and established a dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Greek in culture and language, though they adopted many Egyptian customs and presented themselves as traditional pharaohs. Alexandria became the center of the Mediterranean world, home to the great library, to the lighthouse, to mathematicians and poets and philosophers who shaped Western thought. But the Ptolemies had little interest in the old centers of power deep in Egypt's interior. Memphis declined. Thebes faded. The temples still functioned. Priests still performed the ancient rituals, but the focus of Egyptian life shifted northward, toward the coast, toward the Mediterranean world. The labyrinth at Hawara, which had once been central to Egypt's administration, became peripheral. The nomes still existed, but their officials no longer needed to gather in the great courts. New bureaucratic centers in Alexandria and other cities handled the business of the kingdom. The labyrinth became primarily a temple complex maintained by priests who guarded traditions that fewer and fewer people understood. Still, it endured. When Herodotus visited in the 5th century BCE, the labyrinth was already ancient, but it was still intact, still functioning, still magnificent. Centuries later, Strabo saw it and marveled. It was weathering the change of ages, adapting to new realities while preserving its essential character. Then Rome came. In 30 BCE, after the death of Cleopatra VII and her lover Mark Antony, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. The last remnant of Egyptian independence vanished. The pharaonic tradition, which had stretched back through dynasty after dynasty, reaching into the mists of prehistory, finally ended. Egypt was now just another territory to be exploited for grain and gold. The Romans were practical people. They valued efficiency over mystery, utility over tradition. They looked at Egypt's monuments and saw two things: tourist attractions and building materials. The temples could remain as long as they didn't interfere with Roman administration and as long as they brought in revenue from curious visitors. But anything that wasn't actively useful was fair game for repurposing. The labyrinth still drew visitors. Roman officials and wealthy tourists came to see this legendary structure. But the Romans were not content merely to observe. They needed stone for their own projects: aqueducts and temples, administrative buildings, and garrison fortresses. The labyrinth was a convenient quarry, filled with fine limestone blocks already cut to size. The dismantling began slowly, a few blocks taken here and there from the outer walls where the absence wouldn't be too obvious. But once it started, it was hard to stop. The locals, who had always viewed the labyrinth with reverence, began to see it differently under Roman influence. It was old, from a time that was passing. The gods it honored were losing their power to the new gods Rome brought, and stone was valuable. The priests tried to maintain the complex, but their resources dwindled. The temple estates that had supported them for centuries were confiscated or taxed into unprofitability. Fewer young men entered the priesthood. The old knowledge was not being passed down as thoroughly as it once was. Key rituals were performed less frequently, then not at all. Sections of the labyrinth were closed off, their maintenance deferred indefinitely. The roof began to fail first. Those massive stone slabs laid across the entire complex were held up by wooden beams and copper fittings. Wood rots, copper corrodes. When supports failed, slabs cracked and fell, crashing into the rooms below. Parts of the labyrinth became too dangerous to enter. Sand began to drift in through the broken roof, accumulating in corners, spreading across floors. Christianity arrived in Egypt in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, bringing with it a different worldview. The old gods were declared demons. The temples were pagan abominations. Christian communities sometimes took over ancient sacred sites, converting them to churches or monasteries, obliterating the earlier artwork, inscribing crosses over hieroglyphs. The labyrinth, remote and half-ruined, was not attractive for conversion. It was simply abandoned. The last priests locked its doors and walked away, taking with them whatever knowledge they still possessed. Where they went, what became of them, whether they tried to preserve some fragment of the old traditions in secret, we do not know. They vanished into history, and the labyrinth was left alone. The desert is patient. It does not rush, but it always wins. For 1,000 years, the labyrinth stood empty. Wind howled through its broken halls. Sand accumulated in drifts against its walls and poured through gaps in the roof. What had once been The most complex structure on Earth became a ruin, then a shell, then a mound in the desert that might have been anything. The local population changed. Christianity gave way to Islam. Arabic replaced Coptic as the common language. The memory of what had stood at Hawara faded from common knowledge. The people knew there were ruins there, yes. The mound was obviously artificial. Old blocks of worked stone were visible in places. Some said it had been a palace. Others said a temple. A few old stories spoke of tunnels and treasures beneath the sand. Occasionally, someone would dig into the mound, looking for anything of value. They might find a carved block suitable for reuse, perhaps a piece of statuary, broken but still recognizable. Maybe some smaller items that had been overlooked by earlier scavengers. But the scale of what lay beneath was hidden by the sand, and the effort required to excavate properly was beyond what any individual or even a village could undertake. The labyrinth, which had taken decades to build and had functioned for 2 millennia, was being erased. Every year, a little more was lost. Stone was quarried away for new buildings. The fellahin, the farmers, needed stone for their houses and walls. The mound at Hawara was convenient. They didn't think about what they were destroying. They were simply taking what they needed, as people do. In Europe, during these same centuries, the memory of the labyrinth persisted in a different form. Scholars read Herodotus and Strabo. They debated whether the accounts were accurate. Some believed them. Others were skeptical. A building with 3,000 rooms? More impressive than the pyramids? It seemed impossible, exaggerated by the ancient writer's love of the marvelous. But the accounts were so detailed, so matter-of-fact in many ways, that complete dismissal was difficult. Herodotus had been to Egypt. He had seen the pyramids and described them reasonably accurately. Why would he invent the labyrinth? And Strabo, centuries later, independently confirmed the basic description. These were not men writing fantasy. They were historians and geographers attempting to document the world as they found it. So the labyrinth became a puzzle, a mystery, a challenge. Where was it? Had it really existed? If it had, what had happened to it? The answer lay beneath the sand at Hawara, but no one in Europe knew that. The connection between the Greek accounts and the ruins near the pyramid had been lost. Egypt, to European scholars, was a distant land known primarily through ancient texts and Bible stories. Direct knowledge was sparse and unreliable. That began to change in 1798 when Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. He brought with him not just an army, but a commission of scholars and scientists tasked with documenting everything they found. The Description de l'Égypte, published in multiple volumes over many years, introduced Europe to the reality of ancient Egypt in unprecedented detail. The scholars mapped sites, copied inscriptions, measured monuments. They saw the pyramids and temples with their own eyes, not through the lens of ancient texts. And they learned that Egypt held wonders beyond anything they had imagined. The Rosetta Stone was discovered during this period, eventually leading to the decipherment of hieroglyphs. Egyptology was born as a scientific discipline, but even Napoleon's scholars did not identify the labyrinth. They visited Hawara, saw the pyramid, noted the massive mound of rubble nearby, but did not connect it to the legendary structure described by Herodotus. The destruction was too complete. What little remained visible looked like the ruins of many other sites scattered across Egypt. In the decades that followed, Egyptology became increasingly sophisticated. Excavations were conducted with more care, techniques improved. Scholars learned to recognize patterns, to understand how Egyptian structures were built and how they deteriorated. The map of ancient Egypt was filled in, site by site, monument by monument. And still, the labyrinth remained elusive. In 1843, a German Egyptologist named Carl Richard Lepsius visited Hawara. He was systematically documenting Egyptian monuments, measuring and recording them for posterity. When he examined the large mound near the pyramid, something caught his attention. The sheer size of the rubble field suggested a structure of unusual magnitude. The types of stone present, the architectural fragments he could identify, pointed to something more than just a mortuary temple. Lepsius proposed that this might be the site of the Lost Labyrinth. He published his theory, backed by careful measurements and analysis, but he did not excavate. The task would be enormous, requiring resources and time beyond what he could command. He noted the site's significance and moved on, hoping someone else would follow up. That someone was Flinders Petrie, one of the most meticulous archaeologists who ever lived. Petrie came to Hawara in 1888, determined to excavate the pyramid and, if possible, locate the labyrinth that Lepsius had identified. He spent months at the site, directing workers in the careful removal of sand and rubble, documenting everything they found, no matter how small. Petrie's excavation of the pyramid itself was frustrating. The tomb had been thoroughly robbed in antiquity, and the burial chamber was flooded with groundwater. The famous quartzite sarcophagus of Amenemhat III was there, but empty, its lid broken. The treasures that once surrounded the king were long gone. But the pyramid was only part of Petrie's goal. He turned his attention to the vast rubble field to the south. As his workers began to clear the area systematically, the scale of what had been destroyed became apparent. This was not a temple. This was something far larger. Petrie found foundations covering acres. He found column bases by the hundreds, indicating halls of enormous size. He found fragments of inscriptions and statuary, including pieces of the colossal seated statues that ancient writers had mentioned. He found evidence of courts and corridors, of a complex layout that extended far beyond anything normally associated with pyramid complexes. He also found that almost nothing remained standing. The structure had been so thoroughly dismantled that, in most places, only the lowest levels of foundation survived. The stone had been carried away over centuries, reused in buildings throughout the region. Even the floor slabs had been taken in many areas. What Petrie was excavating was essentially the ghost of the labyrinth, an impression left in the bedrock. Yet even this ghost was impressive. Petrie calculated that the building had covered an area of roughly 300 meters by 250 meters. It had been oriented north-south, with its main entrance on the north side. The foundation walls, where they survived, were massive, built to support a structure of multiple stories. The column bases suggested a hypostyle hall of staggering proportions, with forests of columns creating interior spaces unlike anything else in Egypt. Petrie found tantalizing clues, but not the answers he sought. He could confirm that a massive structure had stood here. He could show that it matched, in general terms, the descriptions given by ancient writers. But the 3,000 rooms, the labyrinthine corridors, the underground levels, all of that was gone, obliterated so completely that reconstructing the original plan was impossible from what remained. And the treasures, the knowledge, the secrets that might have been hidden in the labyrinth's depths, if they had ever existed, they were gone now, either looted in antiquity or buried so deep beneath the rubble that excavating to reach them would require moving millions of tons of debris. Petrie published his findings, noting with barely concealed disappointment that the labyrinth had been found but was lost again, destroyed beyond meaningful recovery. He moved on to other sites, other discoveries. Hawara faded back into relative obscurity, but the mystery did not die. Throughout the 20th century, other archaeologists visited the site. Small excavations were conducted. Surveys were done using increasingly sophisticated techniques. Ground-penetrating radar was employed, searching for voids beneath the sand that might indicate intact chambers. Magnetic surveys looked for anomalies that might point to buried structures. Some of these surveys produced intriguing results. Anomalies were detected beneath the rubble field. Regular patterns that suggested intact architecture might still exist below the disturbed layers. But confirming these findings would require excavation, and excavation at Hawara is extraordinarily difficult. The groundwater table has risen since ancient times. What was once dry desert is now, at certain depths, saturated with water. The pyramid's burial chamber is flooded. The lower levels of the labyrinth, if they survived, would also be underwater. Excavating under such conditions requires pumping, shoring, and specialized techniques that are expensive and time-consuming. Moreover, the sheer volume of rubble that would need to be moved is daunting. Estimates suggest that millions of cubic meters of debris bury the site. Even with modern equipment, clearing it all would take years and cost millions of dollars, and there is no guarantee that anything significant would be found. The destruction might extend all the way down. The underground chambers might have collapsed. The treasures might have been looted millennia ago. Yet the possibility remains. Somewhere beneath the sand at Hawara, there might still be intact sections of the labyrinth, chambers that were sealed before the structure was dismantled, passages that were buried and forgotten rather than quarried away. The entrance to the lower levels, if it can be found, might lead to spaces that have not been entered since the last priests locked the doors and walked away. The labyrinth has become Egyptology's great white whale, the mystery that has frustrated generations of archaeologists, the discovery that everyone wants to make, but no one has the resources to pursue properly, and so it waits, beneath the desert, keeping its secrets. What was the labyrinth's true purpose? Beyond the functional explanations, the administrative offices and temples and tombs, why did Amenemhat III conceive of something so elaborate, so deliberately complex? Some scholars argue it was primarily symbolic. The labyrinth represented Egypt itself, with all its divisions and deities unified in a single structure. Each nome had its place, each god its chapel. To walk through the labyrinth was to walk through the entire kingdom in miniature, to comprehend through architecture the intricate unity that held Egypt together. Others suggest it was a kind of cosmic map, a three-dimensional representation of the Egyptian understanding of reality. The upper levels represented the world of the living, ordered and bright. The lower levels represented the duat, the underworld, mysterious and dark. The connection between them embodied the connection between life and death, between the visible and the hidden, between the known and the unknowable. There is also a more esoteric theory, one that exists on the fringes of mainstream Egyptology, but persists nonetheless. This theory holds that the labyrinth was a machine of some kind, not in the modern sense of gears and levers, but in the ancient sense of a structure designed to accomplish a specific spiritual or metaphysical purpose. Ancient Egypt was a civilization deeply invested in the idea that physical forms could affect spiritual realities. The shape of a temple mattered. The orientation of a building mattered. The proportions, the materials, the decorations, all of it was carefully calculated to create specific effects. A temple was not just a place to worship the gods, but a mechanism for making the gods present, for drawing divine power into the material world. If this perspective is applied to the labyrinth, interesting possibilities emerge. The complex layout might have served to confuse and trap malevolent spirits. The multiple courts might have created acoustic effects useful for ritual. The precise alignment with cardinal directions and astronomical events might have allowed the structure to function as a kind of calendar or observatory. The underground sections might have been designed to channel groundwater in ways that served both practical and ritual purposes. There are hints in the ancient texts that something unusual happened within the labyrinth, references to oracles that spoke from its depths, stories of initiates who entered and emerged changed, if they emerged at all, accounts of healing miracles and prophetic visions. These might be mere legend, stories that accumulate around any sufficiently mysterious place. Or they might point to something real, to experiences that the labyrinth was specifically designed to create. The problem is that without access to the structure itself, without the ability to study it in detail, these theories remain speculation. We can read the ancient accounts and make inferences. We can study the ruins and extrapolate. But we cannot know for certain what the labyrinth was truly meant to do or what happened within its walls. What we do know is that it mattered profoundly to the ancient Egyptians. It was not just another monument. It was the monument, the structure that even the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom had not attempted. It represented an ambition and a vision that stretched the limits of what ancient engineering could accomplish. And when it was destroyed, something irreplaceable was lost. Not just a building, but a key to understanding how the ancient Egyptians thought about space, complexity, and the relationship between physical structures and spiritual realities. The loss of the Library of Alexandria is often mourned as one of history's great tragedies. All those books, all that knowledge, gone forever. But perhaps the loss of the labyrinth is equally tragic. It was a text written in stone and space rather than ink and papyrus, but a text nonetheless, containing ideas and information that might have transformed our understanding of ancient Egyptian culture. Now it is gone, reduced to rubble and memory. The desert has reclaimed it, and we are left with questions that may never be answered. Hawara today is a quiet place. Tourists who come to Egypt usually skip it, drawn instead to the more famous sites at Giza and Luxor. Those who do make the journey find a pyramid that has seen better days, its limestone casing long since stripped away, leaving a weathered core of mud, brick, and stone. Beside it stretches a vast field of rubble and sand, unremarkable to the untrained eye. But stand in that field and look carefully. The ground is not level. It rises and falls in ways that suggest buried walls. Fragments of carved stone lie half buried in the sand. Run your hand over them, and you can feel the hieroglyphs, worn but still present. Pick up a piece of limestone and turn it over. One side is rough, quarried. The other is smooth, polished, meant to be seen. Each fragment is a piece of the labyrinth. Each stone was cut by hands that have been dust for 4,000 years. Each block was placed according to a plan that took decades to execute. This rubble field is a monument, though a shattered one. It is what remains of something that was once one of the wonders of the world. The local guardians, the men who watch over the site and hope for bakshesh from the occasional visitor, know the stories. They can point to where Petrie excavated. They can show you the slight depressions that mark the locations of column bases. They will tell you, if you ask, about the tunnels that are said to run beneath the sand, about the chambers that no modern person has entered. Whether these chambers actually exist is an open question. Some researchers believe that at least portions of the lower labyrinth survived intact. The underground sections were carved into bedrock, roofed over with massive stone slabs, and then buried as the upper structure was dismantled. They might have remained sealed, protected by the very rubble that was piled on top of them. In 2008, a Belgian-Egyptian team conducted a detailed survey of the site using ground-penetrating radar and other geophysical techniques. They published results showing extensive anomalies beneath the rubble field, regular patterns of walls and rooms, voids that might be corridors or chambers, all arranged in a grid-like layout consistent with ancient descriptions of the labyrinth. The team estimated that an area of roughly 4 hectares, about 10 acres, showed these anomalies. If their interpretation is correct, this would represent a significant portion of the original structure, preserved beneath the sand. But interpretation of geophysical data is not straightforward. What looks like a wall might be a geological feature. What looks like a void might be loose sand. Only excavation can confirm or deny the findings. To date, that excavation has not been conducted. The site is protected by Egyptian antiquities law. Digging requires permission from the Supreme Council of Antiquities, and permission is not easily granted. The resources required are substantial, the technical challenges are significant, and the political situation in Egypt has, at times, made large-scale archaeological work difficult. So the labyrinth, or what remains of it, continues to lie beneath the sand, waiting, as it has waited for centuries, patient as the desert itself. There is something fitting about this. The labyrinth was always about mysteries, about hidden knowledge, about things that were not meant to be easily found. Perhaps it is appropriate that it remains hidden even now, revealing itself only in fragments and suggestions, forcing us to work for every scrap of understanding. The ancient Egyptians believed that names had power. To speak something's name was to make it present, to give it life. The labyrinth's name has never been forgotten. It appears in ancient texts, in scholarly papers, in books and documentaries. We keep speaking its name, keeping it alive in memory, even as its physical form crumbles into sand. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the labyrinth's true function was always this: to be a mystery, to be something just beyond our grasp, to remind us that the past holds secrets we may never fully uncover. The pyramids are solved, their interiors mapped, their purposes understood, but the labyrinth remains unsolved. It remains a question without an answer. The labyrinth's influence extended far beyond its physical existence at Hawara. The concept of a massive, complex structure that embodied order within apparent chaos became a powerful symbol in ancient thought. The word itself entered the Greek language, and from there spread to other cultures. When we speak of something being labyrinthine today, we mean it is intricate, confusing, difficult to navigate. We mean it has layers of meaning or structure that are not immediately apparent. This usage descends directly from Herodotus's description of the Egyptian labyrinth, though most people who use the word have no idea of its origin. The mythical labyrinth of Crete, built by Daedalus to house the Minotaur, might have been inspired by tales of the Egyptian labyrinth that reached the Aegean world. The Greeks were fascinated by Egypt, viewing it as the source of ancient wisdom and mysterious practices. They sought out Egyptian priests as teachers. They tried to understand Egyptian mysteries and incorporate them into their own traditions. The idea of a building so complex that one could become lost in it, and of something dangerous hidden at its center, resonated with Greek culture. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur became one of their great myths. But the Greek labyrinth was imaginary. The Egyptian labyrinth was real, and in being real, it was far more remarkable. Medieval and Renaissance thinkers were fascinated by descriptions of the labyrinth. They drew plans of what they imagined it looked like, trying to visualize the structure from ancient accounts. These plans varied wildly since the descriptions were incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Some showed a building like a maze, with walls creating dead ends and false paths. Others showed a vast palace with rooms radiating from central courts. None of these reconstructions was accurate, but they served a purpose. They allowed scholars to think about architecture as something more than functional shelter. They raised questions about the relationship between form and meaning, about how a building's design could embody philosophical or religious concepts. The labyrinth became a theoretical space, a problem to be solved, a puzzle that engaged some of the best minds of their times. The Renaissance obsession with ideal forms and perfect proportions owed something to this fascination. If the ancient Egyptians could build a structure of 3,000 rooms that somehow held together as a unified whole, what principles governed that unity? Could those principles be rediscovered and applied? Could modern architects create new labyrinths, new structures of perfect complexity? Some tried. The gardens at Via d'Este in Italy include labyrinthine pathways designed to confuse and delight. The hedge mazes that became popular at European palaces and estates were conscious attempts to recreate the experience of being lost in complexity. These were trivial compared to the Egyptian labyrinth, of course, but they showed the power of the idea. In literature, the labyrinth became a metaphor for the human condition. We are all wandering through a complex structure we did not build and do not fully understand, searching for meaning, trying to find our way. The center of the labyrinth represents truth, enlightenment, death, or God, depending on the author's perspective. The journey through it represents life itself. Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine writer, was obsessed with labyrinths. He wrote stories about infinite libraries and gardens of forking paths, about structures that contained all possible books or all possible futures. His work explicitly references the Egyptian labyrinth, though he treats it as a symbol rather than a historical site. For Borges, the labyrinth represents the universe itself, infinite and incomprehensible. Modern architects occasionally invoke the labyrinth when designing buildings meant to convey complexity or mystery. Museums, libraries, religious structures, places where the experience of the space is meant to be part of the message. They cannot match the scale of the original, but they aspire to its ambition. And in Egyptology, the labyrinth remains a kind of holy grail. Young archaeologists dream of being the one to finally excavate it properly, to reveal what lies beneath the sand at Hawara. Established scholars publish papers proposing new theories about its construction or purpose. The site appears regularly in books and documentaries, always with the qualifier that it remains mostly unexplored. The technology exists now to do a proper excavation. Ground-penetrating radar can map what lies below. Drones can survey the site from above. 3D modeling can reconstruct the structure virtually before a single shovel breaks ground. If funding could be secured, if political conditions allowed, if the Egyptian authorities could be convinced to permit it, the labyrinth could be investigated in ways that Petrie never imagined. Perhaps someday it will be. Perhaps future archaeologists will find the entrance to the lower levels and descend into chambers that have been sealed for 2,000 years. Perhaps they will find treasures, or texts, or nothing but collapsed corridors and broken stones. Perhaps they will finally answer the questions that have persisted for centuries. Or perhaps the labyrinth will remain as it is, a mystery beneath the sand, a question without an answer, a monument to human ambition that serves its purpose best by staying just beyond our reach. There is a paradox at the heart of the labyrinth's story. It was built to be permanent, to last forever, to stand as an eternal testament to the power and vision of its creators. And yet, of all Egypt's great monuments, it is the one that has most completely vanished. The pyramids still stand, the temples at Karnak and Luxor are still magnificent, but the labyrinth, which was supposed to surpass them all, is gone. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about permanence. Nothing lasts forever, not stone, not civilizations, not even memory. Given enough time, everything dissolves back into sand and silence. The labyrinth stood for 2 millennia, which is longer than most human creations survive, but it was not long enough. The ancient Egyptians understood impermanence better than we sometimes give them credit for. Their religion was built around it. Death was the central fact of existence, the transition that defined life's meaning. Their monuments were attempts to slow time's erosion, to create islands of permanence in a sea of change. But they knew, deep down, that even their most ambitious efforts would eventually fail. Perhaps that's why they put so much emphasis on names and memory. If the physical structure would eventually crumble, the name could survive. The story could be passed down. Future generations could remember, even if they could not see. In a sense, this is exactly what has happened with the labyrinth. The building is gone, but the name endures. We still speak of it, still wonder about it, still search for it. The labyrinth teaches us something about wonder. We are fascinated by it, not despite its destruction, but because of it. If it still stood intact, it would be just another tourist site, impressive, but knowable. Because it is lost, it has become infinite. Our imaginations can fill in what the archaeological record cannot provide. Each person who contemplates the labyrinth envisions it differently, creating their own version in their mind. This is the paradox of mysteries. We say we want to solve them, to know the answers, to dispel the uncertainty. But mysteries have a value in their unsolved state. They keep us curious. They keep us asking questions. They remind us that there are things beyond our current understanding, spaces where knowledge has not yet reached. The modern world has very few mysteries left. We have mapped the Earth's surface completely. We have photographed every major monument. We have satellites that can read license plates from space and submersibles that can reach the deepest ocean trenches. The unknown places are becoming vanishingly small. But the past is different. The past is full of mysteries that we can never fully solve, not because we lack the technology, but because the evidence has been lost. We can make educated guesses. We can use sophisticated analysis to extract information from fragmentary remains. But we can never know with absolute certainty what it was like to walk through the labyrinth when it was new, to see its walls covered in fresh paint, to hear the chants of priests echoing through its halls, to understand exactly what its builders intended. And maybe that's acceptable. Maybe not everything needs to be known. Maybe some mysteries serve us better by remaining mysterious. The labyrinth stands in our collective imagination as a symbol of this idea. It represents the limits of knowledge, the boundaries beyond which certainty cannot reach. It reminds us to be humble in our claims of understanding, to accept that some questions may never have definitive answers. At the same time, it inspires us to keep searching. Every generation of archaeologists has taken another crack at Hawara, hoping to be the one who finally reveals the truth. They do this knowing the odds are against them, knowing that they will probably find nothing new, knowing that they might spend years of their lives excavating sand and rubble. They do it anyway, because the possibility of discovery, however remote, is worth the effort. This is what wonder does. It pulls us forward, makes us take risks, encourages us to invest ourselves in quests that may never be fulfilled. It gives meaning to the search itself. Separate from any eventual finding, the journey becomes its own reward. The labyrinth, lost beneath the sand, continues to call to us. It says, I am here, somewhere, waiting. Come find me. Not everyone who searches will succeed. Most will fail. But the search itself will change you, teach you, show you things about the past and yourself that you never knew. This is the labyrinth's final gift, not knowledge, not certainty, but the invitation to wonder. Night falls over Hawara. The temperature drops rapidly, as it always does in the desert. The stars emerge, brilliant in the absence of competing lights. The same stars that shone down on Amenemhat III as he surveyed his unfinished monument. The same stars that guided priests through their midnight rituals. The same stars that Herodotus saw when he stayed near the labyrinth, trying to comprehend what he had witnessed. The rubble field lies silent. Wind moves across it, carrying sand in patterns that shift and change. Somewhere beneath, in darkness that has lasted for centuries, the labyrinth's remnants wait. Stone blocks that once formed walls still rest in the configuration their builders intended. Hieroglyphs still spell out prayers and proclamations, though no eyes see them. Chambers that once echoed with human voices hold only silence now. If the lower level survived, if the sealed chambers remain intact, they are like a message in a bottle cast into the ocean of time. The bottle floats, unseen, carrying its contents forward through centuries. Eventually, someone will find it, open it, read the message. But when? And what will it say? Perhaps the message is simpler than we imagine. Perhaps it is just this: we were here. We built something magnificent. We thought it would last forever. We were wrong, but we tried anyway. That is the human story, repeated across every civilization and age. We build, we create, we pour our dreams into stone and wood and metal, into words and images and music. We hope these things will outlast us, will carry something of who we were into the future. Sometimes they do, often they don't. But we keep trying, because the alternative is to accept impermanence without resistance, to acknowledge our mortality without protest. The labyrinth was a protest against mortality on a massive scale. It was Amenemhat III saying through architecture that he mattered, that his kingdom mattered, that the complexity and beauty of Egyptian civilization mattered enough to be preserved in the most elaborate structure human hands could build. The protest failed. In the end, the labyrinth fell. But the attempt was glorious, and the fact that we are still talking about it, still searching for it, still dreaming about what it might have been, means that the protest is not completely over. Some part of what Amenemhat intended has survived, encoded not in stone, but in our collective curiosity. So the labyrinth endures, in a way, not as a physical structure, but as an idea, not as something that can be mapped and measured, but as something that lives in imagination and scholarship, in speculation and wonder. It has become what the ancient Egyptians always hoped their monuments would become: a bridge between the past and the present, a way for the dead to speak to the living, a proof that human creativity can transcend the limitations of mortal existence. Beneath the sand at Hawara, in darkness and silence, the labyrinth waits. It has been patient for 2,000 years. It can wait longer. Time means nothing to stone. The desert can pile 1,000 more feet of sand on top of the ruins, or the wind can strip everything down to bedrock. It makes no difference. What was built there once existed, and its existence changed the world in ways both obvious and subtle. Someday, perhaps, someone will finally excavate it properly. Advanced techniques will reveal what remains. Robots will explore flooded chambers that humans cannot enter. Virtual reality will reconstruct the labyrinth in its original glory, allowing us to walk through it as Herodotus did, to experience the wonder that he tried and failed to adequately describe. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the labyrinth will remain forever beyond our reach, a mystery that refuses solution, a question that will not be answered. Perhaps this is fitting. Perhaps this is what it was always meant to be. Either way, the story continues. The search goes on. And as long as humans wonder about the past, as long as we are drawn to mysteries and fascinated by lost wonders, the labyrinth will remain what it has always been, the greatest monument that almost no one has ever seen, the most complex structure ever built by human hands, the maze that exists now more in minds than in stone. The stars turn overhead, the wind whispers across the sand, and somewhere beneath it all, in chambers sealed and forgotten, the labyrinth keeps its secrets. Let them sleep, let them wait, let the sand drift and the centuries pass. The labyrinth has all the time in the world, and so our odyssey ends, not with answers, but with questions, not with certainty, but with wonder. This is perhaps the most honest ending, the most true to both history and the human experience. We began with the promise of a journey to ancient Egypt. We have walked through time, exploring the rise and fall of one of history's most ambitious monuments. We have searched alongside generations of archaeologists, shared their frustrations and their fleeting moments of discovery. The labyrinth remains lost, but in searching for it, in telling its story, in keeping its memory alive through words and wonder, perhaps we have found something else. Something about ourselves, about why we care about the past, about why mysteries matter. The day is almost done. The stars shine bright over Hawara, over the desert, over the dreams of ancient builders and modern searchers. Sleep comes, as it always does, bringing its own labyrinth of dreams and shadows. Thank you for traveling with us tonight. The journey may be over, but the wonder remains. Until our next odyssey, rest well